Everyone. Um, we will be reading more histories today of the Daughters of the Utah Pioneer, early settlers of Providence, Utah. My first history I'd like to read to you is the sketch of the life of Anne Barbara Loosely Furman. One by one, the members of that great caravan Utah pioneers who traversed prairies, plains, and mountain pastures to seek a refuge in the wilderness turn their faces forward to the land of eternal peace. For them the day is done. They have tracked the desert sands of life, long journey to the end of the way, but the radiant glow of life's setting sun cast a line of light along the silent path with present memories and over the uncertain future with hopeful promise. My grandmother, Anne Barbara Loosely Furman, was born September 1st, 1833 in Canton, Switzerland. She was the daughter of Andreas Loosely and Barbara Kaiser. She had no record of her life before her marriage to Jacob Furman, December 5th, 1856, at the age of 23 in Switzerland. She had no record of her life, but Jacob Furman, at the age of 23 in Switzerland, whom the gospel was introduced into their vicinity. These two stalwart young people heard and understood its message. On the 14th of February in the year 1856, they were baptized and confirmed members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. On March 16, 1860, in accompanying with her husband, one child, two brothers, one sister, and friends, left their native land, home, parents, and loved ones, and sailed for America. They crossed the ocean in a sailing vessel, requiring 6 or 7 weeks to reach New York City. From New York, they traveled to St. Joseph, Missouri, and from there they sailed in a flatboat up the Missouri River to Florence, Nebraska. They stayed at Florence long enough to make final preparations for their journey across the plains. They joined the James T. Ross Company, which consisted of 36 wagons drawn by ox team. Grandfather Jacob Furman drove a team of oxen across the plains to pay the passage for himself and his wife. Grandmother walked most of the way, a distance of 1,013 miles, and carried her baby Godfrey in her arms. Her sister and 2 children died and were buried on the plains. They arrived in Salt Lake City September 3rd, 1860. They were persuaded by John Tyre to move to Cache Valley. They settled at Spring Creek, later called Providence. Grandfather was a carpenter by trade, and shortly after arriving, built a one-room log house of which they were very proud. In later years, it was replaced by a larger house and was used as a workshop and granary. Their first flour bin was 5 feet high, divided into 2 sections, one section for flour and the other for shirts. This bin was also served as a safe hiding place for the children when the Indians raided the town. Grandmother was one of those women whose greatness lies in walking nobly among the common things of life. She performed the task of a pioneer woman, baking, darning, gardening, candle dipping, starch making, and weaving. She washed and corded the wool, spinning and dyeing her own yarn. She made hats by braided straw hats for the ladies and braided the whole straw for the men. The hats were shaped on wooden forms and bleached in airtight barrels containing sulfur fumes. She owned the first sewing machine in Providence, for which grandfather traded 5 fat steers. The cost of the machine was $140. Grandmother was a natural-born seamstress. She made many of the dresses and bonnets for the ladies in her community. She had some standard patterns which she could adjust to fit any figure. She also could cut out any article without a pattern. All these things were dignified under her hands which were never idle. She was ever ready and always willing to help her husband. In the fall, when the wheat was being harvested, she would take her children into the field, including the baby who had a shock of wheat for his bed, and gleaned the wheat. She also spent many hours husking corn and stripping canes. Although she had a large family of her own, for several years she shared her home with her sister and family, who was her husband's second wife. In peace, in joy, in sorrow, in privation and plenty, she still found time as an angel of mercy to visit the sick and administer those in need, and also for those who she served lovingly in the hour of bereavement. Could they but raise their surely called her blessed, to help you to give it at last earthly hours in sowing and preparing for the last earthly rest for she who had been there in company with other Relief Society sisters. She served faithfully as a visiting teacher in the Relief Society for many years. Her hospitality was excelled in her warm treatment of those who came from their native country, Switzerland. No traveler from the old country, pioneer or tramp, was ever denied a welcome. Not only were those who came to the home treated kindly, but she often sent food to the needy, fruits, vegetables, clothing, and bedding to the poor immigrants who had come to Utah and had not yet found employment. During her last year, she endured a great deal of physical suffering, but the courage, fortitude, and patience and her cheerful and unquestioning faith remained with her to the end. Her noble, gentle, and unselfish character shone out brightly to all her sufferings. Never was she heard to utter a word of complaint or despondency. Her children, whose homes were near, could be found frequently at her bedside, but with her sweet patience and cheerfulness made it a comfort instead of a trial to her loved ones to be there with her. She was the mother of 9 children, 4 sons and 5 daughters. One child died before she left Switzerland. 2 of her sons were filled foreign missions and one served faithfully as a bishop and citizens and true Latter-day Saints. She died March 28, 1895, at the age of 68. Although her life seems short, to us it was long in experience and accomplishments. Blessed be her memory. May those who follow in her footsteps emulate her many virtues. Okay, the next person we will be talking about is the sketch on the life of Louis Frank. Lou, or Louis, as he was most affectionately called throughout his life, was born during the night of April 30th, 1866. It was raining and the water was leaking through the roof. His mother was in bed with an umbrella over her and the baby. The cabin was built with willows with dirt in between, and the roof was made with willows, dirt, and straw. Over the door hung a buffalo skin. He was the second child and the eldest son of Charles Anderson and Anna Olson Frank. Later that spring, the family moved from this humble abode, which was on the corner of what is now called Adams Field, to the south of Logan Canyon, where the building of the road through to Bear Lake was to begin. Louis's mother was the toll gate keeper, and his father was secretary for the construction. Louis's father was the first banker and commercial attorney in Logan. People used to call him the walking bank, as he would make change, etc., for them while walking along the street. He immigrated here from Gothenburg, Sweden, and located in Logan in 1863. Louis attended Sunday school in a frame building located outside of north corner of First North and Main Street. In the winter, they had held Sunday school in the old Bowery building on the Tabernacle Square. While he was yet a small boy, he worked with his father at the old ZCMI and stayed there at nights during the construction of the building. When the building was finished, his father was the bookkeeper and night watchman. When Louis was 7 years old, his father built a home on the southeast corner of 2nd South and Main Street, and this served as the family home from then on. Like many of the children in those days, he went to school barefooted. The building was located where the Logan High School Seminary now stands, and had very little schooling, but he was an outstanding penman and mathematician. Throughout his life, he searched after truth and knowledge. When he was 14 years old, he went to work for the Thomas Jessup Company on the railroad, where they built railroads into Idaho, Oregon, Montana, and Washington. At that time, it was while he was with the railroad crew in Oregon that he became ill with mountain fever and was very ill for several weeks. No one thought he would live, but through the faith of the brother Jessup and his brother Val, they administered and said that he would live. But his body looked like a skeleton. But then his body began to get stronger each day, and he was soon able to work again. When winter weather stopped their work, they would return to Cache Valley. Then he did carpenter work and worked for ZTMI. He, along with some of the other young men from Logan, would often go to Providence on social occasions, and it was there that he met the lovely Ella Hatterley. After a courtship of 5 years, they were married by Apostle Mariner E. Merrill in the Logan Temple. They lived in Logan the first winter, and then they moved to Providence. The next winter, on December 4th, their twins were born. They named them Louis and Luella. When the babies were 9 months old, the little boy died of pneumonia. Father moved his family back to Logan for the winter of 1892 and 93. And another daughter, Hazel, was born. The next summer, he worked for Grother's Hill in Logan Canyon, and he lived there during the summer. He helped Uncle Henry Hadley move his sawmill to Star Valley, and on his return trip, one of his horses died. We were back in Providence again, and his second son, Austin, was born on November 23rd, 1895. He hauled lumber out of the canyon for the home where W.R. Zollinger family lived, but before the house was finished, we moved to Bear Lake under the old church ranch in Newman Valley. Father left here in April. Mother and the 3 children left here in May, and when we got there, Father was very ill. He suffered with blood poisoning in his hand and inflammatory rheumatism also. He wasn't able to do any work, but he didn't go on that time. He did not die at that time. It was snowing, and Father went to get the threshing done. Marie, another daughter, was born that October, 1897. We moved into the Nauman for this winter to part of Joseph Skinner's home. The first summer at the old church ranch, brother and sister Hopkins Rice lived with us, and the next year John Gibbs and his sister Nellie lived with us. The next summer, Father filed a homestead and built a 2-room home out of green lumber he hauled out of Skinner's Canyon. John Kinnock moved the lumber. Lavinia was born in this house on July the 2nd, 1899. By the time fall came, the lumber in the house had warped so the wind could really blow through. So we moved into Charles Barchie home. I will remember that winter. Father took part in a show called Coriantumr and had to go to Montpelier for rehearsals. He didn't care much for dancing, but he would dance the square dance occasionally. However, Mother enjoyed dancing, and he would take her and his big bearskin coat, and while she danced, he would make himself comfortable on the benches with his coat and sleep. The following year, due to the ill health of Grandmother Hatterley, we moved back to to Providence to take care of her. We lived in part of the Hatterley home. Father started hauling lumber from the Grother mill again. He loved horses and took a great deal of pride in training them to do just as he wanted them to do. He always had an understanding team of horses. He was a very witty and cheerful disposition and had many friends, and he was had a beautiful tenor voice, not only belonged to the ward choir, but also sang with the old Sunflower Glee Club, which Joseph A. Smith, Sr. conducted. He was Providence City Marshal for 2 terms and watermaster on the Blacksmith Fork irrigation ditch in 1908 to 1909. In May of 1909, when the ward was divided, he was put in as the first ward clerk, which position he held for 17 years. He acted as a home missionary with Brother Joseph Cowley for several years before the old Cache stake was divided. In the spring of 1911, he and his brother Val and his son-in-law Fred Jensen went to Metropolis, Nevada, and filled on a homestead, but they came back in July. No work at the carpenter trade and former father-in-law's farm. Finally, he bought a farm of his own just north of town from Gottlieb Jessel Sr. He lived to see the progress of harvesting from the cradle to the combine harvester. His children, Genevieve, Rada, Windsor, and Seth, were all born in Providence during the years from 1901 to 1913, making 12 in all for the couple. In the year of 1922, he started a small dairy business and was successful until his health broke, and he sold it and worked on his farm. While he was still in the dairy business, his son Windsor passed away from a heart ailment on July the 24th, 1927. In 1920, his son and his daughter Hazel filled a mission in the northern states for the church. In 1936, his daughter, Winetta, passed away from spinal meningitis following the birth of another girl. The baby died also. She left her husband and 2 small children. Father's health grew steadily worse, and he spent the winter of 1937 through 1938 from a heart attack. Father was ill at the time and grew worse until on the 2nd of May, 1938, at the age of 72, he passed on to his reward. He left his noble wife, 6 daughters, 1 son, 34 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren to mourn his passing. Okay, the next person we will be talking about, this is the history of Elizabeth Enns Frederick. Elizabeth Enns Frederick was born in Switzerland on the 17th day of February in the year 1831. Her father, Benjamin Enns, was a farmer owning a large tract of land, and her mother, Anne Barbara Beatman Enns, was also of humble rank, but both were persons of exceptional character and startling piety. Elizabeth, my mother, was the youngest of 11 children, all of whom greatly revered father and mother. It was customary in that country for both male and females to work on the farm. Therefore, my mother, with the rest of the family, worked in the fields. My mother's early education was acquired in the public school of the town of her birth, being compelled to work hard before and after school to help maintain her father's family. When yet a child, exhibited great ability at school as well as at home, being a careful student, a keen observer, and a thorough worker. Her parents belonged to the Protestant church and were very devout in their religion, owing to their mother was carefully trained of the church past religious duties until after her 70th year, when the ministers of the church passes on all the young folks, gradually those who were worthy, she got through with high honors and the blessings of the ministers and teachers. Mother's youngest brother had learned the trade of manufacturing cloth and established large factories in his hometown, where some 850 men and women received employment. In this work, my mother was taken in with him to help manage the business. Sometime afterward, there was a war that broke out in Switzerland between the Catholics and the Protestant. Reformers had arisen. This caused business to slump, and instead of exploring their goods to all ports of the country, my mother and her brother only supplied merchants with goods in the near cities. This necessitated considerable traveling to place the goods and to make collections. My mother was left at home in charge of the business, while her brother did much of the traveling. While on most of the trip and not returning at the usual time, the family became alarmed and set out to reach him. His horse and buggy was found, but he had been thrown out and was dead. The people in their neighborhood believed he had met with foul play, as the Catholics were bitter towards the Protestants. But the doctor claimed that he came to his death by a paralytic stroke. As a result of the fatality, Mother's older sister was compelled to take his place, but in a short time she took sick and died, and as a result, the entire business with its responsibility devolved upon my mother. Not very long after this, her mother became ill and gradually declined and died New Year's Day, 1853. The business was gradually cut down, and at that time went on my mother and acquainted with a young man, Arnold Frederick, from Hillheim, a neighborhood town about 15 miles distance. The acquaintance grew to friendship and admirations, and in February 1856 she was married to him. After the marriage, the same month and year, her father died. My mother had been in mourning for 7 years, and as 7 deaths had taken place in the family during this time. This undoubtedly was a severe trial to her. Her husband, Arnold Frederick, was a tinsmith by profession, owning and operating a large business establishment in connection with a large farm. My mother's early training had eminently fitted her for a helpmeet for her business. Their business prospered, and success crowned their efforts through their diligent toil, so that they were amassing a small fortune in the city of Muhlheim, Count Thurgun. In the year 1865, my mother first heard the gospel of Jesus Christ as revealed by the Latter-day Prophet, preached by Elder Karl G. Maser, who then was president of the Swiss and German mission. Mother had been devout and religious inclined, besides having a good knowledge of the Bible, was not long in accepting the doctrine taught by the elders, then declaring it to be the true gospel of Jesus Christ. She applied for baptism, was baptized by President Karl G. Maser in September of 1869. From that time until our departure from our native land in Mormon, elders had come with us. We immigrated to Utah in June of 1870. My mother was always liberal with her means in doing good, especially helping those in need. Large sums were spent in immigrating saints to this country. My mother, Elizabeth Frederick, was the mother of 6 children, 5 of whom were born in their native land. And they had a son named Hiram, which passed away was born in Providence right after their arrival. On the journey to Utah, Mother had many trying experiences, but her faith never failed her. Salt Lake City was reached July 1870 in the Karl G. Maser Company. Brother Mazer counseled my parents to move to Cache Valley. The railroad had just been completed to Ogden, and we stayed in Ogden 1 week then, and a chance was obtained to go far north as Willard, Utah. From Willard, Utah, Brother Chaz Rammel and Fred Tyre transported us to Providence by team. After a short time in Providence, Father bought a home, and as he had a surplus of money, he helped other settlers pay for their land rather than obtain more for his home himself. My mother was as energetic as ever in helping Father and in improving the home and its surroundings. She worked as hard as a man in tilling the soil and making advancements, ever admonishing her children to be God-fearing and industrious. She even went to the canyon with Father to pick up limbs for firewood. The children were still small and unable to do much. Mother also started her children and went with them gleaning wheat. We gleaned over 30 bushels the first season, which was enough for bread for that first year. During the following year, she raised all kinds of vegetables and fruits and sold most of them, delivering them to customers in Logan. This showed her energetic disposition, both industrially and spiritually. Mother led the family, and she taught them correct principles. Mother has done a great amount of good in the various capacities. She has always been a strict observer of the law of tithing and in paying fast offerings. She has been very charitable, always helping any worthy cause, especially in looking after and helping the poor and needy. She has ever been a faithful church worker, and yet never forward or speaking publicly, but working quietly and energetically for her God, her family, and her religion. She has served as a teacher of the Relief Society in the ward for many years and was a frequent visitor of the sick, but being unable to do so now, owing her to poor health and disability. At the time, she feels very lonely. She was a widow for 24 years. Father had died in December of 1892. She had also buried one daughter, Bertha, wife of Godfrey Furman, and mother of 6 children. Her 3 sons had performed honorable foreign missions, and Albert is serving as his second mission in the northern states. She has spent much time and money in genealogical work of her own and Father's families. She has performed considerable ordnance work for the dead relatives in the Logan Temple, but owing to her poor health, she is unable to do it now. She is appropriating her means for these purposes and setting the work done for others. It says, I am satisfied that my mother had so far lived a useful and unselfish life, and therefore is worthy of the reward promised the faithful. She had ever been a good example to her children, teaching them to be honest, prayerful, earnest, energetic, faithful, and true to God and man. Her motto has been, rather suffer wrong than to do wrong, and be at peace with everybody. On the 17th of February, 1916, she was 85 years of age. She bears a strong testimony to the work of the Lord established in these the latter days. She died January 1970 at the age of 86. Okay, our last story I will read to you today is the sketch life of Sarah Goulds Gilbert. And this was given to about her by her grandmother. If you would cast the veil of the present aside and travel back a century into the countryside of a certain foreign land, you would find a village, quiet, green, at times foggy, and surrounded by low rolling hills. There would be Low huts clustered close together. There would be many hedges. Beyond the village would be fields of grain, hay, and vegetables. In the field, men would be working with hoes, spades, sickles, and scythes. There would be no binders, mowers, or heavy tractors as we would see today. Above is the description of a typical country town in England. In such a little town, Grafton, Wiltshire County, England, on the 13th day of October, in 1828, Sarah Gilbert was born. She was the sixth child of the family. Her father's name was John Gules, and her mother was known as Priscilla Kempton Gules. Sarah grew to womanhood and married James Gilbert of East Grafton, Wiltshire County, and they became the parents of 12 children. While grandfather delivered coal, grandmother was busy with her household duties and growing children. Along with her housemaking duties, she found time to go out once a week and wash for wealthy families nearby. One night she had a friend and her friend were returning home. They were attracted by two Mormon missionaries holding a street meeting. Much against the wishes of her family, they stopped and listened to the story of the restoration of the true gospel. Grandmother was converted to the truthfulness of their message and told her friend, "Those men have the truth. I don't care what others say." She told grandfather Gilbert and her brother Jacob about this new doctrine. Jacob was a shoemaker and passed the Gilbert home each day to get to his shoe shop. Very often he would call in and listen to the grandmother explain the Mormon tracts. There was a branch of the church at Burbage, about 2.5 miles from their home. Grandmother and her son Elijah and her brother Jacob attended the meetings every Sunday. Finally, the branch was discontinued. Later, the Gilberts moved about 10 miles east into a town called Inkpen, Berkshire County, where they became acquainted with the late James E. Talmage's family. Grandfather continued to deliver coal. As his business increased, he purchased a large delivery wagon and discarded one of his horses on account of it being blind. Grandmother was desirous of her entire family coming into Zion. She prayed earnestly that the balance of their family would accept the gospel, which they did, one by one. Grandmother was a resourceful woman who worked at many angles to help grandfather make a living and set aside funds for the immigration to Utah. She conceived the idea that grandfather should place seats enough in his discarded coal van for 8 passengers and herself, and also give her the blind horse. He complied with her request. Every market day she would haul 8 passengers to the shopping center. In connection with her van business, she bought farm products and sold them in town, and bought merchandises from town and sold to the villagers. She was agent in the city newspaper, which she bought and resold on her return home. Many people were waiting along the road to purchase her wares. After each trip, she put enough money away for the tithing and donations for the Salt Lake Temple, which she sent with returning missionaries years before the family immigrated. Her son Elijah found employment as soon as he earned enough money for transportation to come to Richmond, Utah. Later, he went to the church farm in College Ward, which is south of Logan, and worked for Brigham Young. In time, funds were procured to send the oldest unmarried daughter to Utah, and Eliza came with the James E. Talmage family to Provo, where she married and raised a large family. Then Daniel, my father, was next to come. He was very bashful and had never been in London. Grandmother pinned a blue ribbon on the lapel of his coat and wrote the mission headquarters in London to that effect so they could be able to find him and take care of him. In 2 years, Aunt Ellen followed. She accompanied returning missionaries to Richmond. She was only 15 years of age. Grandmother had explicit faith in the elders. She said our Ellen was just a wee bit of a girl, but the Lord looked around about her and pointed out the way. Uncle Elijah and Daniel soon obtained employment in the church farm near Logan, Utah. In 3 years, enough funds were procured to send for the rest of the family. Meanwhile, grandmother was making preparations to leave. Finally, the money arrived. Their meager belongings were packed, and the time was getting near for their departure to the train. Everything seemed to be going along fine until grandmother saw several of grandfather's friends approaching with a large jug of beer, mixed with something stronger. Her heart was very sad. They shared the contents of the jug with grandfather. While under the influence of the beer, they proceeded to discourage grandfather by telling him that the ship was an old one and would sink in the middle of the ocean. Grandfather believed them and decided to remain in England. The time for leaving had arrived. Grandmother heard grandfather's remark. It was a very important moment. She called the 5 little children to her side and all kneeled in prayer. She pled with her Father in heaven to change her husband's mind. She started Uncle Jesse and Uncle Albert down the road with part of the luggage. Then, with Uncle Charles in her arms, Aunt Emily and Uncle James clinging to her dress, she invited herself to the beer party on the lawn. She approached grandfather with a prayer in her heart. She said, "Jimmy, be ye going with me, or be ye going to bide here?" Grandfather hesitated a moment, looked at his friends, then looked at his family. After several minutes, an unseen power changed him from the irresponsible, drunken man to a sober, dutiful father. He took the baby from her arms and said, "Sally, suppose I'll go with ye," and left his jolly friends. Grandmother often remarked about her beer party she broke up on her last day in England. They set sail on the ship Wyoming in 1878. All went well until they reached the middle of the ocean. A terrible storm arose, the worst one the sailing crew had ever encountered. The ship turned on its side. Furniture and beds were tipped around. Grandfather was on guard. As the storm raged, he found his way to the sleeping quarters and reminded grandmother of the warning his friends had given him about the old ship sinking in the ocean. Grandmother responded with the ship would not sink while transporting Mormons. She immediately fell upon her knees in prayer and asked that same Jesus who calmed the raging storm when he and his apostles were sailing to rebuke the storm with a small, powerful hand. In a short time, the tempest was stilled. The ocean was calm and quiet. The crew remarked that they had never before witnessed such a change in such a short time. Grandmother had implicit faith in her Father in heaven. At one time, 9 of their children were stricken with typhoid fever. The parish doctor told her that it would be impossible to save all the children. She continued to pray for their recovery. One time, Uncle Albert was so near death that they put a mirror and placed it under his nose and mouth to see if there was any sign of breathing. However, he fully recovered and later became a bishop in Idaho. The family arrived safely in Richmond, Utah, where they lived 3 years and then moved to Fairview, Idaho. They gave $35 and a horse for a quarter section of land. Grandmother served her church well by working in every capacity in which she was called. I can recall the first primary I attended. She took my hand and found a seat for me and my sister Nellie. She was an ardent temple worker, performing 499 endowments for her progenitors. She was full tithe payer. She was very efficient midwife and assisted in bringing several hundred babies into the world. She delivered most of her grandchildren. Once Aunt Ellen Heyer was expecting a new baby. When the time arrived, Uncle Andrew sent for grandmother to come. At this time, Uncle Andrew's daughter, by his second wife, Aunt Lizzie, was very ill. He was needed in both homes. Kind-hearted Aunt Ellen came to his rescue. She said, "Andrew, now that Mother is here, I can get along okay. You stay with Aunt Lizzie. She needs you." The next morning, as he entered the house, Grandmother took him into the bedroom. He was greeted with a thankful wife and twin boys, Ira and Ora. Aunt Ellen was a true polygamist wife. She was present when I arrived and gave me my first bath. Grandmother was baptized the 8th of June, 1851. She left England in 1878 and received her endowments on the 22nd of May, 1879 in the Logan Temple. All the children came to Utah except 2 sons. The oldest one settled in Australia. After his death, he was sealed to his parents. The second one married and joined the LDS Church and remained in England. However, 3 of his sons came to Utah. He too was sealed to his parents. Grandmother sent her son Daniel with a team and wagon for 2 weeks to haul rock from Green Canyon to help build the Logan Temple. Grandmother was an expert with horses. She had soon taught the blind horse to travel along the road, drawing 8 passengers van safely. With her guiding line and familiar voice, their understanding was mutual. In Fairview, Grandfather owned a racehorse named Tommy. While he was being trained, Grandmother was not allowed to drive him. As soon as his racing days were over, she was in full charge of the horse. On the racetrack, he was a very high-spirited animal, but under her care, he was very docile. I have ridden many times to Franklin, Idaho with Grandmother to shop, and as we traveled along the road, she would talk to him as one talks to another. Their understanding was mutual also. I recall one time Grandmother wanted to visit Aunt Ellen, who lived in Lewiston, Utah. She hitched Tommy to her wagon and drove along the way. As she approached the large canal in Lewiston, Tommy made her understand that he was thirsty. Grandmother alighted from the buggy, removed the bridle, and stood by the buggy while Tommy enjoyed a drink. When he was through drinking, he made a mischievous nod of his head, crossed through the canal, and proceeded down the street on a slow walk. There was no bridge, and the water was deep, so Grandmother was horrified. She cried, dash it, Tommy, come back and get I." Grandmother noticed a man coming along the road. He at once understood her predicament. He stopped the walk-away horse, put the bridle on his head, and drove him back to Grandmother. She thanked the man for his kindness, scolded the horse, climbed into the buggy, and proceeded to Aunt Ellen's home. Grandmother had blue eyes, was 5'2", weighed 170 pounds. She passed away in Fairview, Idaho, on the 11th of May, 1918. I stayed with her the night before she died. Grandmother, with her zeal and power to do, with her faith and love of God, you established a heritage and a blessing for your posterity. Your descendants will forever be grateful to you for these years of triumph. Fight to leave us this wonderful heritage. Okay, that's all for today. There'll be more coming as soon as I can round up some more stories. I enjoy very much sharing these with you. I think these people are so devout members of the church, and it's so worth sharing these testimonies and these stories to you. Hope to see you again soon. Thank you.